Your guardian angel might be your worst nightmare. Robert Mitchell learned this the hard way when he hired what seemed like the perfect nanny for his twin boys who hadn't slept through the night in 6 months. Every caregiver had quit. Every expert had failed. Then, 28-year-old Keisha Williams walked through his door with a promise that seemed impossible. She could fix everything in 3 weeks. She delivered on that promise. The boys slept like angels. The house fell silent. Robert finally had peace. But that peace came at a price so shocking, so calculated, that when the truth emerged, it would shatter everything he thought he knew about trust, desperation, and the people we invite into our most sacred spaces. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is the story of Robert Mitchell, a successful real estate developer from Connecticut, who thought he had found salvation in the form of 28-year-old Keisha Williams, a nanny with impeccable credentials and a gentle smile that promised solutions to problems that had consumed his family for months. What Robert didn't know was that Keisha carried secrets that would eventually lead to one of the most disturbing cases of child endangerment in the state's recent history. This isn't just a story about a nanny who crossed unthinkable lines. This is a story about how desperation can blind us to dangers hiding in plain sight, how our need for peace can make us complicit in our own deception, and how sometimes the person who promises to save your family might be the very one tearing it apart from the inside. Robert Mitchell had built an empire from nothing. Starting with a single rental property in his 20s, he had transformed himself into one of Connecticut's most successful real estate moguls by age 45. His mansion in Westport stood as a testament to 2 decades of relentless work, smart investments, and the kind of drive that turns dreams into reality. But success comes with a price. And for Robert, that price became devastatingly clear when his wife Sarah was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer at 38. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just Robert's wife, she was his partner in every sense of the word. She had been there when he bought that first property, had helped him navigate the early struggles of building a business, had celebrated every victory and weathered every setback. When their twins, Michael and Matthew, were born, she seamlessly transitioned into motherhood while still managing the administrative side of Robert's growing empire. She was the kind of woman who could negotiate a $1 million deal in the morning and host a perfect dinner party that evening, all while making it look effortless. Her illness came without warning, aggressive and unforgiving, and within 18 months of diagnosis, Robert found himself a widower with 2-year-old twin boys and a grief so profound, it threatened to consume everything he had worked to build. The first months after Sarah's death were a blur of funeral arrangements, legal proceedings, and the overwhelming realization that he was now solely responsible for raising 2 toddlers who were too young to understand why their mother had disappeared. Robert threw money at the problem the way he always had, hiring a succession of highly recommended nannies, each one coming with glowing references and promises of bringing stability to his chaotic household. But toddlers don't respond to credentials the same way business partners do, and one by one, these carefully vetted caregivers found excuses to leave. Some lasted weeks, others barely made it through their first night. The twins, perhaps sensing the instability in their world, became increasingly difficult to manage. What started as normal toddler sleep resistance evolved into something far more challenging. By the time Michael and Matthew turned 4, they had developed a pattern of behavior that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. Every evening became a war of attrition. The boys would go to bed at 8, only to be up again by 9, crying, screaming, demanding attention with a desperation that seemed almost frantic. They would calm down for an hour, maybe 2, before the cycle repeated. This pattern continued throughout the night, every night for 6 solid months. Robert tried everything the experts recommended: consistent bedtime routines, sleep consultants, pediatric evaluations, even brief experiments with letting them cry it out that left everyone in the house emotionally exhausted. The boys showed no signs of illness, no underlying medical conditions that might explain their behavior. They were simply 2 traumatized children acting out their grief and confusion in the only way they knew how, and no amount of money seemed capable of buying a solution. The impact on Robert's life was catastrophic. His business began to suffer as sleepless nights blurred into exhausted days. He found himself making mistakes he never would have made before, missing important meetings, struggling to maintain the sharp focus that had built his empire. His housekeeper, Maria Santos, a woman who had been with the family since before the twins were born, watched helplessly as the man she respected fell apart. Maria had her own children, understood the rhythms of family life, and what she was witnessing went beyond normal parenting challenges. This was a household in crisis, and she could see that without intervention, something would eventually break that couldn't be repaired. It was Maria who suggested reaching out to Bright Future's nanny agency, a high-end service that specialized in difficult placements. They charged premium rates but promised they could handle situations other agencies wouldn't touch. When Keisha Williams walked into the Mitchell mansion for her interview, she carried herself with a confidence that was immediately noticeable. At 28, she possessed the kind of calm authority that made parents feel like their problems were already solved. Her resume was impressive in all the right ways: a degree in child psychology from a respected state university, certifications in pediatric first aid and childhood development, and references from 3 previous families that painted her as nothing short of miraculous. During the interview, she listened to Robert's description of the boy's behavior with the patience of someone who had heard similar stories many times before. When he finished, she asked thoughtful questions about their daily routines, their eating habits, their relationships with other caregivers. Then she made a statement that would haunt Robert for years to come. She looked him directly in the eyes and said with absolute certainty that she could have the boys sleeping through the night within 3 weeks. Not hoping to improve their sleep, not working toward better rest patterns, but guaranteeing complete resolution of a problem that had defeated everyone else who had tried. Robert wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. But 6 months of failed attempts had taught him to manage his expectations. When he asked how she could be so confident, Keisha's response was both reassuring and vague. She explained that children who acted out at bedtime were usually responding to anxiety and overstimulation, that her approach focused on creating an environment of deep calm and security that would allow their natural sleep patterns to reassert themselves. She spoke about the importance of consistent routine, about reading children's emotional cues, about the delicate balance between boundaries and comfort. Everything she said made perfect sense, aligned with what sleep consultants had told him before, but there was something in her tone that suggested she possessed techniques others didn't. When pressed for specifics, she gently deflected, explaining that her methods were highly individualized and would need to be tailored to Michael and Matthew's particular needs once she had a chance to observe them in their home environment. The decision to hire Keisha wasn't difficult. Robert was desperate, the boys needed help, and she was the first person in months who had spoken about their situation with genuine confidence rather than cautious optimism. They agreed on a salary that was substantially higher than what previous nannies had earned, with the understanding that she would be responsible for all aspects of the boys' evening routine and nighttime care. Keisha would arrive each afternoon at 4, take over their care until Robert returned from work, handle dinner, bath time, and bedtime, then remain in the house overnight to manage any sleep disruptions. It was an expensive solution, but Robert had reached the point where cost was irrelevant if it meant getting his life back on track. Keisha's first week in the Mitchell household seemed to validate every positive impression from her interview. She moved through the house with quiet efficiency, quickly establishing routines that the boys responded to with surprising cooperation. She prepared nutritious meals they actually ate, led them through bath time without the usual battles, and created bedtime rituals that seemed to genuinely relax them. Most importantly, she approached their evening resistance with a patience that never wavered, never showed frustration, never raised her voice even when they tested her boundaries. By the end of her first week, the boys were going to bed with minimal protest and staying in their rooms for longer stretches than they had in months. Robert allowed himself to feel cautiously optimistic, but he had been disappointed too many times to celebrate prematurely. It was during Keisha's second week that something shifted dramatically. On Monday night, Michael and Matthew went to bed at 8 and didn't make another sound until 7 the next morning. Robert woke up naturally for the first time in months, confusion briefly overtaking relief as he realized what had happened. When he found Keisha in the kitchen preparing breakfast, she simply smiled and said the boys had slept beautifully, that they seemed to be settling into healthier patterns. Tuesday night brought the same result. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Each night a perfect 11 hours of uninterrupted sleep. By the weekend, Robert was experiencing something he hadn't felt since before Sarah's diagnosis. Genuine rest. His mind felt clear, his energy was returning, and he found himself able to focus on work with an intensity he had forgotten he possessed. The change in the household dynamic was remarkable. The boys, who had been fractious and difficult during the day, suddenly became cooperative and pleasant. They ate their meals without fuss, played quietly when asked, and seemed genuinely content in ways that had been absent for months. Maria, who had witnessed the chaos of the previous months, marveled at the transformation. The house felt peaceful in a way that reminded her of the days before Mrs. Mitchell's illness, when family life had flowed with natural rhythm rather than constant crisis. Everyone was sleeping, everyone was calmer, and the sense of impending breakdown that had hung over the family was replaced with something approaching normalcy. But Maria Santos had raised 4 children of her own, had worked in households with young families for over 2 decades, and she possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of child behavior that comes from years of close observation. What she was seeing in Michael and Matthew didn't quite match her experience of how children typically transition to better sleep patterns. In her experience, improvement was gradual, marked by occasional setbacks and the kind of inconsistency that characterizes most developmental changes. Children might sleep well for a few nights, then have a difficult evening, then sleep well again as they slowly adjusted to new routines. What was happening with the Mitchell boys was different. Their transition had been abrupt and absolute, as if someone had flipped a switch that changed their behavior overnight. More troubling to Maria was the quality of their daytime behavior. Well-rested children typically became more energetic, more engaged, more curious about their environment. Michael and Matthew had indeed become more cooperative, but there was something oddly subdued about their compliance. They moved through their days with a dreamlike quality that reminded Maria more of illness than health. They would sit quietly for long periods, respond slowly to questions, and seemed to lack the natural exuberance she expected from 4-year-olds who were finally getting adequate rest. When she mentioned her concerns to Robert, he dismissed them with the kind of relief that comes from finally having problems solved rather than created. The boys were sleeping, the house was peaceful, and he was able to function effectively for the first time in months. Whatever Keisha was doing was working, and he wasn't interested in questioning success. As Keisha's 3rd week progressed, Maria's unease continued to grow. She began paying closer attention to the evening routine, noting details she had initially overlooked in her relief at having competent help in the house. Keisha's bedtime ritual was indeed thorough and professional, including warm baths, quiet story time, and gentle music that created a soothing atmosphere. But Maria noticed that the timing was remarkably precise. Every evening, regardless of how the boys were feeling or behaving, they would become drowsy at exactly the same time. Not approximately the same time, not within a reasonable range, but at 8:07 every single night, both boys would suddenly become heavy-eyed and compliant in a way that seemed almost mechanical. Maria had seen children resist bedtime when they were overstimulated, had seen them fight sleep when they were anxious or excited, had seen them go through phases where their natural rhythms were disrupted by growth spurts or changes in routine. What she had never seen was 2 different children, with different personalities and different energy levels, become uniformly drowsy at precisely the same moment every single evening. It defied everything she understood about the individual nature of child development, and it triggered instincts she had learned to trust over decades of childcare experience. The breaking point came during Keisha's 4th week, when Maria decided to observe the bedtime routine more closely. She positioned herself in the hallway outside the boys' bedroom, close enough to hear, but far enough to remain undetected. What she witnessed that evening would change everything she thought she knew about the woman they had trusted with the most vulnerable members of their family. The routine proceeded exactly as it always did. Bath time, pajamas, teeth brushing, then settling into their bedroom for story time and warm milk. Keisha read them a gentle story, her voice soothing and rhythmic, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere any parent would want for their children's bedtime. But as she prepared to leave their room, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. Keisha returned to the kitchen and prepared warm milk for the boys, just as she did every evening. But this time, Maria was positioned where she could see the preparation process clearly. What she witnessed was a woman carefully measuring liquid from a small bottle into each cup of milk, stirring thoroughly to ensure complete mixing, then returning to the bedroom with drinks that looked perfectly innocent, but contained something that had nothing to do with normal bedtime routines. The realization hit Maria like a physical blow. The perfect sleep patterns, the precise timing, the unusually subdued daytime behavior. All of it suddenly made terrible sense. Keisha Williams wasn't helping these children develop healthy sleep habits. She was drugging them into unconsciousness every single night. Maria's first instinct was to confront Keisha immediately, to demand an explanation for what she had just witnessed. But something held her back, some survival instinct that warned her to be careful about how she handled this situation. A woman who would drug children was capable of other things, might become dangerous if cornered, might escalate the situation in ways that could put everyone in the household at risk. Instead, Maria retreated to her own room and spent the night trying to process what she had discovered and decide how to protect Michael and Matthew, while ensuring Keisha faced consequences for what she had done. The next morning, Maria approached Robert with a heaviness in her heart that came from knowing she was about to shatter the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind, trying to find words that would convey the seriousness of the situation without sounding hysterical or making accusations she couldn't prove. When she told Robert that she suspected Keisha was drugging the children, his initial reaction was exactly what she had feared: disbelief, dismissal, and a defensiveness that came from having his solution to an impossible problem suddenly threatened. Robert's response was understandable but heartbreaking. He had been through months of chaos, had finally found someone who could manage his children effectively, and was being asked to believe that his miracle worker was actually a criminal. He demanded to know what evidence Maria had, what exactly she had seen, why she would make such serious accusations against someone who had clearly helped the family. When Maria described what she had witnessed, Robert's skepticism was evident. Keisha prepared warm milk for the boys every evening. That was part of their routine, and there was nothing unusual about adding supplements or natural sleep aids that might help them relax. Many parents used melatonin or chamomile to help children with sleep difficulties, and jumping to conclusions about drug use seemed irresponsible and unfair to someone who had proven herself capable and trustworthy. But Maria had not worked for this family for 6 years without earning Robert's respect, and despite his initial resistance, something in her tone made him reconsider. She wasn't the type of person to make accusations lightly, wasn't given to drama or suspicion without cause, and her concern for Michael and Matthew was beyond question. When she asked him to consider having the boys examined by their pediatrician to test for substances that shouldn't be in their systems, Robert found himself caught between his desperate need to maintain the stability Keisha had brought and his growing fear that Maria might be right about something terrible happening under his own roof. The decision to install hidden cameras was Robert's compromise between his skepticism and his responsibility as a father. If Maria was wrong, the recordings would clear Keisha and allow their successful arrangement to continue. If she was right, he would have evidence of criminal behavior and could take appropriate action to protect his children. The cameras were installed discreetly in the kitchen and the boys' bedroom, positioned to capture the evening routine without being obvious to someone who wasn't looking for them. Robert told himself he was being overly cautious, that he would review a few nights of footage, confirm that nothing inappropriate was happening, and then apologize to Keisha for doubting her integrity. What the cameras captured over the next week would haunt Robert for the rest of his life. The footage confirmed everything Maria had suspected, and revealed details that were even more disturbing than what she had initially observed. Night after night, the recordings showed Keisha carefully adding liquid from small bottles to the boys' warm milk, measuring doses with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. But more chilling than the act itself was Keisha's demeanor as she performed it. There was no hesitation, no sign of internal conflict, no indication that she understood she was harming children. She moved through the process with the calm efficiency of someone following a routine she considered normal and necessary. The footage also revealed the immediate effects of whatever substance Keisha was administering. Within minutes of drinking their milk, both boys would become visibly drowsy, their movements slowing, their responses to questions becoming delayed and confused. By 8:15, they were unconscious in a way that went beyond normal sleep, lying motionless in positions that didn't change throughout the night. This wasn't the natural rest of healthy children. It was the artificial unconsciousness of medical sedation, administered without consent or medical supervision to 4-year-old victims who trusted their caregiver completely. Robert's world collapsed as he watched the evidence unfold on his computer screen. The woman he had invited into his home, the person he had trusted with his most precious possessions, had been systematically drugging his children for over a month. Every night of peace he had enjoyed, every morning he had woken up refreshed, every moment of relief he had felt about his family's improved situation had been built on a foundation of child abuse. The guilt was overwhelming. The realization that his desperation had made him complicit in his own children's endangerment, that his need for solutions had blinded him to obvious warning signs that should have protected them from harm. But the cameras had captured something else, something that would make this case even more complex than a simple story of a dangerous caregiver harming innocent children. The footage showed not just what Keisha was doing, but how methodically she was doing it. The measuring, the timing, the careful observation of the boys' responses, all of it suggested someone with extensive experience in administering sedatives to children. This wasn't the desperate improvisation of someone who had stumbled into harmful behavior. It was the practiced technique of someone who had developed a system over time, someone who had likely done this before with other children in other households. When Robert finally confronted Keisha with the evidence, her reaction was as chilling as her actions had been. There was no denial, no surprise, no attempt to claim misunderstanding or accident. Instead, she responded with a calm rationality that suggested she genuinely believed her actions were justified and appropriate. She explained that Michael and Matthew had been suffering from severe sleep dysfunction that was harming their development and destroying their family's stability. Traditional approaches had failed. Multiple caregivers had been unable to help them, and drastic intervention had been necessary to break the destructive cycle they were trapped in. She had used mild sedatives, carefully dosed based on their weight and monitored for adverse reactions, to give them the rest their bodies needed while their emotional trauma healed. In her mind, she hadn't been harming them. She had been saving them from ongoing damage that would have affected them for years to come. What made Keisha's justification even more disturbing was how reasonable she made it sound. She spoke about the medical research showing the importance of adequate sleep for child development, about the long-term effects of chronic sleep deprivation, about the damage that ongoing family chaos would have inflicted on boys who had already lost their mother. She had taken action when no one else could provide solutions, had given Robert the stability he needed to function as a single parent, had created an environment where healing could finally begin. The fact that she had used medication without medical supervision or parental consent was regrettable, but the results spoke for themselves. The boys were healthier, the family was stable, and everyone involved had benefited from her intervention. This rationalization revealed something perhaps more frightening than simple malice. Keisha Williams genuinely believed she was helping the children she was drugging. In her mind, she wasn't a predator or abuser. She was a specialist who provided services that desperate families needed, but couldn't obtain through conventional channels. She had developed techniques for managing difficult children that went beyond what traditional caregivers were willing or able to do, and she used those techniques to create the peaceful households her clients demanded. The fact that her methods were illegal and dangerous was secondary to her belief that she was solving problems and improving lives. As the investigation into Keisha's background unfolded, the scope of what she had been doing became clear. Police discovered that she had used identical techniques in at least 3 previous positions, always with wealthy families who had difficult children and unlimited resources to pay for results. In each case, she had arrived at households in crisis, promised rapid improvements, and delivered exactly what she pledged through the systematic use of sedatives that left children unconscious for 11 to 12 hours every night. The pattern was consistent: dramatic improvement in child behavior, grateful parents who praised her effectiveness, and arrangements that continued until families moved away or circumstances changed for unrelated reasons. What was most disturbing about this pattern was that none of her previous employers had realized what was happening. Like Robert, they had been so desperate for solutions and so relieved by the results that they hadn't questioned how someone could achieve what professional sleep consultants and medical experts couldn't accomplish. They had attributed her success to superior training, better techniques, or simply a natural talent for understanding children. The possibility that their children were being drugged had never occurred to them, and when police finally contacted these families to inform them of what had been done, their shock and horror mirrored Robert's own reaction to the truth. The legal case against Keisha Williams revealed complexities that went beyond simple criminal behavior. Medical examination of the Mitchell boys showed elevated levels of promethazine, an antihistamine with sedative properties commonly found in prescription cough suppressants. The levels weren't high enough to cause permanent damage or immediate medical emergency, but they were sufficient to cause the deep, unnatural sleep that had characterized their nights under Keisha's care. More troubling was the discovery that she had been gradually increasing the doses as the boys' tolerance developed, following a progression that suggested extensive knowledge of how sedatives affected children's systems. During police questioning, Keisha maintained the same calm rationality she had shown when confronted by Robert. She freely admitted to using medication to help children sleep, explaining that she viewed it as a therapeutic intervention, similar to what doctors might prescribe for severe sleep disorders. She had researched appropriate dosages, had monitored the children for adverse reactions, and had provided a service that had measurably improved their quality of life. The fact that she lacked medical training or legal authority to administer medication was a technical issue that didn't change the fundamental reality that her methods worked when conventional approaches had failed. This perspective revealed the most chilling aspect of Keisha's crimes. She had developed a complete justification system that allowed her to drug children while maintaining her sense of moral righteousness. In her mind, desperate parents who couldn't control their children's behavior were tacitly asking for help that went beyond conventional boundaries. When they expressed overwhelming relief at their children's improved sleep, when they praised her effectiveness and recommended her to other families, when they paid premium salaries for results no one else could deliver, they were endorsing her methods even if they didn't explicitly understand what those methods involved. The trial that followed brought national attention to questions about childcare standards, parental desperation, and the unregulated spaces where vulnerable children intersect with inadequate oversight. Keisha Williams was ultimately sentenced to 3 years in prison for child endangerment, but the case raised broader questions about how many other caregivers might be using similar techniques and how many other families might be unknowingly exposing their children to harm in exchange for the stability they desperately needed. For Robert Mitchell, the legal resolution provided little comfort. His children had been drugged for over a month by someone he had invited into their home, someone he had trusted completely, someone whose criminal behavior he had inadvertently enabled through his own desperation for solutions. The guilt was overwhelming, compounded by the realization that warning signs had been present all along but had been invisible to him because he needed so badly to believe that someone could fix his impossible situation. The boys recovered physically from their ordeal within weeks of Keisha's arrest, but the psychological impact proved more complex and long-lasting. They had formed attachments to the woman who had cared for them during a difficult period, and her sudden disappearance was another traumatic loss in lives that had already been marked by too much instability. Sleep issues returned, though not as severely as before. and both boys required extensive therapy to process not just their mother's death, but also the confusing betrayal of trust they had experienced with Keisha. Maria Santos became a crucial figure in the family's recovery, providing the consistent, trustworthy care that allowed healing to begin. Her decision to speak up when she suspected something was wrong had prevented the situation from continuing indefinitely, and had likely saved the boys from more serious harm. But she carried her own burden of guilt, wondering if she should have acted sooner, if she should have been more insistent in her initial concerns, if there were signs she had missed that could have protected the children from weeks of unauthorized sedation. The case highlighted broader issues about the intersection of wealth, desperation, and childcare that resonated far beyond the specific circumstances of the Mitchell family. Wealthy parents who can afford premium childcare services often have access to caregivers who operate in less regulated spaces than traditional daycare facilities or agency-employed nannies. These arrangements can create environments where inappropriate behavior is less likely to be detected or reported, where the privacy that money can buy becomes a liability rather than a protection. More troubling was the realization that Keisha's success in multiple households suggested that other families might be unknowingly accepting similar arrangements. The pattern of difficult children suddenly becoming manageable under the care of highly effective nannies might sometimes involve techniques that go beyond superior training or natural talent. Parents desperate for solutions might be inadvertently selecting for caregivers who are willing to cross legal and ethical boundaries in exchange for the dramatic results that conventional approaches cannot provide. The investigation into Keisha's methods revealed a disturbing level of sophistication in her approach to drugging children. She maintained detailed notes about each child's weight, sleep patterns, and responses to medication, adjusting doses based on tolerance and effectiveness in ways that suggested extensive research into pediatric sedation. She had developed protocols for introducing substances gradually, for monitoring side effects, and for maintaining the appearance of natural sleep improvement that would satisfy even observant parents. This systematic approach indicated that Keisha had been developing her techniques over years, possibly beginning with less severe interventions and gradually escalating to full sedation as she gained confidence and experience. The progression suggested someone who had started with good intentions, perhaps using mild supplements or natural remedies to help children sleep, and had gradually moved into more dangerous territory as she discovered how much parents were willing to pay for guaranteed results. The psychological evaluation conducted during her trial revealed a woman who had experienced significant childhood trauma related to sleep instability. Keisha had grown up in foster care, moving between homes that provided little consistency or security, often sleeping in unfamiliar places with strangers who viewed her as a temporary burden, rather than a child deserving protection and care. Her adult fixation on creating perfect sleep environments for children appeared to be an attempt to provide the security she had never experienced. But her methods had become dangerously distorted by her need to control outcomes, and her belief that results justified any means necessary to achieve them. This background didn't excuse her actions, but it provided context for understanding how someone could develop such elaborate justifications for harmful behavior. Keisha genuinely believed she was rescuing children from the kind of sleep-related trauma she had experienced, and her success in creating calm, peaceful households reinforced her conviction that her methods were not only effective, but necessary for children's well-being. The impact on the childcare industry was significant, with agencies implementing more stringent background checks and monitoring protocols designed to detect inappropriate behavior before it could harm children. But the case also highlighted the limitations of regulatory approaches when dealing with private arrangements between wealthy families and individual caregivers who operate outside traditional oversight structures. For families who had unknowingly been affected by Keisha's methods, the revelation brought a complex mixture of horror and confusion. Children who had thrived under her care were suddenly understood to have been victims of systematic drugging, but their parents' memories of that period were marked by relief, gratitude, and improved family functioning. The cognitive dissonance of discovering that positive outcomes had been achieved through criminal means created lasting psychological impacts that required professional support to process and understand. Robert Mitchell's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of desperation and the importance of trusting instincts even when solutions seem too good to be true. His experience highlighted how parents' overwhelming need for help can create blind spots that make them vulnerable to exploitation, and how the intersection of wealth and childcare can create environments where harm occurs despite good intentions and abundant resources. The case raised questions that extend far beyond individual criminal behavior to broader social issues about support for struggling families, standards for childcare providers, and the responsibility of communities to protect vulnerable children even in wealthy households where need might not be immediately apparent. It demonstrated that child endangerment can occur in any environment, regardless of economic status or apparent sophistication, and that vigilance must be maintained even when problems seem to have been solved. Today, Michael and Matthew Mitchell are healthy teenagers who have overcome the trauma of their early childhood experiences through extensive therapy and the love of family members who learn to prioritize their well-being above their own convenience or comfort. Their father continues to struggle with guilt about his role in enabling their harm, but has become an advocate for better regulation of private childcare arrangements and more support for families dealing with challenging child behavior. Keisha Williams served her full sentence and now works in administrative roles that don't involve direct childcare responsibilities. She maintains that her methods, while legally problematic, provided genuine help to families in crisis, and that the children under her care were better off for her intervention, despite the controversy surrounding her techniques. This unrepentant perspective serves as a reminder that the capacity for self-justification can transform even harmful behavior into something the perpetrator views as necessary and beneficial. The questions raised by this case continue to resonate. How do we balance parents' desperate need for help with children's right to safety? What responsibility do we have to recognize and report concerning behavior when it produces desired outcomes? How do we protect vulnerable individuals in private arrangements that occur outside traditional oversight? And perhaps most troublingly, how many other situations like this might be occurring right now, hidden behind closed doors in households where desperation meets opportunity, and where the people we trust most might be the ones causing the most harm? These questions don't have easy answers, but they demand our attention and our commitment to creating systems that protect children while supporting families in crisis. The story of Robert Mitchell and his children serves as both a warning about the dangers that can hide behind solutions that seem too good to be true, and a reminder that sometimes the most important protection comes from the courage of ordinary people like Maria Santos, who trust their instincts and speak up when something seems wrong, even when everyone else wants to believe everything is fine. In the end, this case isn't just about one dangerous nanny or one family's traumatic experience. It's about the broader human tendency to accept help without questioning its source when we're desperate enough, and the responsibility we all share to remain vigilant for signs that vulnerable individuals might be suffering, even when surface appearances suggest everything is perfect. It's a story that challenges us to examine our own assumptions about trust, safety, and the price we're willing to pay for peace of mind. And it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous threats come not from strangers, but from the people we invite closest to those we love most.